Welcome to today's Inspired Talk, Mastering Change at Any Age with Bruce Feiler. I'm Seth Streeter, Mission Wealth's Chief Impact Officer. Our purpose as a firm is to empower people to realize true wealth. And we know true wealth is about a lot more than optimizing our finances. These Inspired Talks are designed to help improve our lives and expand our wealth across different dimensions. I'm so excited for today's conversation that will cover many timely topics, including how we can make the most of our life transitions, ways to create more meaning in our lives, and how we can have productive, values-based conversations with our families, even including about money topics. Before we begin, let me share a few instructions. We'll be recording this event, and we will email you the top takeaways along with a video link at the end. We will allow ample time for questions for Bruce, so please post your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. And please use the chat box if you need any technical support or to respond to any questions. And at the end of the program, you will receive a survey, and we really do appreciate your feedback. I'd love to start with a poll to see how on brand our audience is with this topic. So let's go ahead and start the poll here. And the question is, have you entered or ended a life transition period within the last 5 years? And then the second part of the question is, if you said yes, what type of transition was it? Were you empty nesting like Bruce and I have recently? Did you just retire, sell your company? Maybe you had a career change. Was there a change in your marital status, or maybe you lost a loved one? So please put into the chat, the poll here, your answers to these two questions, and we'll see where we are as an audience. All right, we have a drum roll here. Let's see how this landed. Do we have anyone in the room who's gone through a transition? Okay, it looks like yes, 62%, Bruce, say that I'm entering a life transition, and another 19% say I just ended a life transition. And 20% haven't yet, but we know they will. And as far as the type of transitions, 12% had a change in marital status, 7% had empty nesting, 22% retirement, yeah, me as well, and then 27% had a career change, and then 11% lost a loved one. So these are all big transitions in our lives, and I'm really looking forward to diving in and discussing them. So we're in the right place. We have the right expert to talk about this. So it's my pleasure to introduce Bruce Feiler. He's the author of 14 books, 7 of which are New York Times bestsellers. His books include The Secrets of Happy Families, Life is in the Transitions, Council of Dads, and earlier this year, he published The Search, Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World. He's a very popular New York Times columnist and in-demand speaker at top universities and corporations, and his 3 TED Talks today have more than 4.3 million views. I could go on, but I'd much rather dive in and have us experience Bruce's curious mind and brilliant insights directly, so let's get started. Today, we will cover 3 broad sections. The first will be mastering life transitions. The second is the future of work and how to find meaning in work. And then the third are the secrets of happy families. And we will be taking related questions in each section. So please do post your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So welcome, Bruce. We really appreciate you joining us today.
My pleasure, Seth. Thank you for inviting me. I feel like we're old friends at this point, and I feel cheated. I couldn't vote. The panelists were not allowed to vote in the poll because in the last 100 days, I published a book, watched my identical twin daughters graduate from high school, celebrated 15 years of cancer, 20 years of marriage, and then became an empty nester at the end of the summer. And I've been looking around. Does anybody I know anything about life transition? So I am hoping to learn something today, and how wonderful to have such a big crowd with us.
Well, we will definitely be crowdsourcing some wisdom today. So we will make it a collective effort here. But to kick us off, Bruce, maybe we can talk about just transitions. What does it mean when you talk about living or not living a nonlinear life?
So I think if I were going to try to capture a lot of the anxiety and sort of sense of unease in the culture today, and if I were to try to put it in a sort of sentence or bumper sticker, for those of us who remember bumper stickers that might frame this conversation, is that in our lives we have linear expectations but nonlinear lives. And it is the tension between these two things that creates, I think, a lot of the sense of being off track or off kilter or sort of off center or off what you expect in some ways. So to go back a little in the story and kind of set up how it is that I became interested and sort of ended up in the middle of this conversation. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, and I actually just celebrated my 40th high school reunion last weekend. But I had what I now think of as a conventional linear life. Like I graduated from high school in Georgia. I went to Yale, and I went there, and I went to Japan in the mid 1980s. And you mentioned these books that I've written. It doesn't happen this way, but I sold my first book at 24. And in my 20s, I wrote books about Japan and England. And I spent a year as a circus clown. You can see me on a juggling on the back of a camel up there. And the camel, because in my 30s, I went back and forth to the Middle East and writing books about contemporary religion and spirituality. And this was in the wake of 9/11, when it seemed like we were on the brink of a cultural war. And in there, I got married and had children. And this is sort of the fantasy that we all expect, what I'm calling here the linear life. But then in my 40s, my life was totally upended. First, I got cancer at 43 as a new dad of identical twin daughters, as I mentioned earlier. Then I had some financial troubles in the last recession. And then my dad who had Parkinson's, got very depressed and tried to take his own life 6 times in 12 weeks. And this, in every way, kind of threw my life off kilter. And I'm a storyteller, right? I've spent my whole life thinking about stories, and suddenly I couldn't tell my life story, and I didn't know how to. And in a lot of ways, I felt ashamed about that. And when I did, what I found is that everybody goes through these moments in their lives where they don't know how to tell their story too. And so what I have done in the last 6 years is travel across the country, collecting and analyzing hundreds of life stories of Americans of all ages, all backgrounds, all walks of life, people who lost homes and lost loved ones, who changed careers and changed religions, who got sober and got out of bad marriages, a lot of the things that we just saw in that poll, Seth, as you know. And I was looking for patterns that could help all of us when we go through these times. And so what did I learn? I would say the first thing I learned is exactly what you've just asked me, which is that the idea of the linear life is dead. Those of us who are 40 plus, we grew up at a time when we were told everyone does the same thing in your 20s, everyone does the same thing in their 30s, then everyone has a midlife crisis between 39 and 44 and a half. That was the original research. This idea turns out to be bunk, right? We do not live our lives based on graphs that you might see in an undergraduate textbook. So the linear life is dead, and it's been replaced by what I call, and what we're talking about here, which is the nonlinear life, which is the idea that change comes at you from all directions, often when you least expect it. So my data show that we all go through 36, 3 dozen what I call disruptors in the course of your life. These could be as small as a fender bender or twisting your ankle, or as large as a natural disaster or a pandemic. And that's every 12 to 18 months, right? And that's often that many of us see a dentist. And most of these we get through pretty well, but a significant percentage of them, 1 in 10, that's 3 to 5 times in our lifetimes, we go through a massive period of change, right? And this is what I call a life quake. And about half of these are voluntary, and about half are involuntary. So what's an involuntary one, right? You get fired, you lose your job, you lose a loved one. As I said, there's a natural disaster or a pandemic. But about half of them are voluntary. Like I keep mentioning my daughters here, their birth was amazing and it was joyful. And it was a life quake. Like everything about our lives had to change, right? Retirement, right? We just saw whatever the number was, 22% of people in a retirement. Like that might be voluntary and joyful, but it is a massive change. And so we go through these regularly. And if you do the math, okay, I think the signature piece of data that I have is that the average length of a life quake and the life transition that comes out of it is 5 years. So you think 3 to 5 in a lifetime, 4, 5, 6 years. That's 25 years. That's half of our adult lives where we spend in transition. And that leads to the last big thing I've learned, which is that transitions are a skill that we can and must master. I mean, if you look at the data we just had, right, 62%, if I have the number correct, are in a life transition. 19 just ended one. That's 80% of people in the last few years have been in this period of change. And what the way we have talked about change, I mean, what's the headline of this seminar? Mastering change at any age. We've talked about change as period you have to grit and grind and resilience your way through. We are looking at them as deviant periods to get us back to the stability. But if we do that, then half of our lives, we're looking at periods of struggle. But in fact, if we look at them what they are, which is as periods of growth and renewal, we are turning half of our lives into something that we are ashamed and fearful and scared of, into something that involves a lot of pain, but can involve a lot of growth and renewal.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you for framing it that way. And since it's something we can all relate to, maybe we can talk about kind of what do we do knowing that this is something we're in or will be in. You talk about your transition toolkit. I just love that. Maybe you can talk about like, what are the ways we can best navigate these transitions that are going to be happening?
So I think that the first thing that I would say about this is, now that I've been out there a few years talking about transitions, you mentioned this TED Talk, a couple of million views, and this book, now 2 books. I would say that the reaction to my work, and this is a technical scientific term, is like you are naming this thing that I feel that I haven't named. And the power of naming it is to normalize it and to validate it and to say you're not alone. We just saw 62, that's almost 2/3 of people that have just joined us, a relatively random group of 150 people are going through a transition. You or someone you know is going through one right now. Okay, so the first thing is to normalize it, right? As my wife likes to say, I have hard knowledge about soft things. So this is a soft thing, but it doesn't mean it's not real and has hard consequences in your life, okay? The second thing is, what do people do? So when people get into a life transition, they tend to do one of 2 things, okay? They either make a 212 item to-do list and say, I'm going to get through it in a weekend and I'm going to be the best that ever was. And I'm going to get a blue ribbon, right? I mean, if I had to guess, that's what you are. Like I'm organized and I'm on it. Okay. The second thing people do is they lie in a fetal position under the covers with a cat and they say, I'm never going to get through it. And woe is me. And like my life is very miserable and no one can possibly understand what I'm going through. Okay. Well, I'm almost tempted to say which, give us a show of hands here, which is which. But what I want to tell you is that both of those are wrong. Okay. And in fact, if you look at enough of them, these transitions have a certain structure, and that leads to what you teed up in this conversation. So transitions have 3 phases. Okay. I call them the long goodbye, where you accept that you're in your transition and you often use ritual to mark them. There's what I call the messy middle, where you shed certain habits and create new ones. And then there's the new beginning, where you sort of update your story, your life story, and then you, share this new self with the outside world. Okay, so you got 3 phases. And here's the thing about the 3 phases, that everybody's good at one and everyone's bad at one, right? So everyone has a transition superpower, if you will, and then everyone has a transition kryptonite. So where do you start? The answer is whatever you're good at. Like if you're good at turning the page, right? And having a little ceremony, where you go to a sweat lodge or, burn something in the backyard or put out a flag, or, if you're good at that, then start there. But maybe you're bad at that. Maybe you're a people pleaser. Maybe you don't want to stand up for yourself. Like maybe you don't want to admit, like if you go back to the pandemic in say 2020, we had what I would call a crisis of the long goodbye, right? Because everybody was, if we just go inside for 6 weeks and then we're going to go back to where, no, we were never going to go back. It was always obvious that we were going to a new place, but we held on because we didn't want to say goodbye to the old life. And then what happened was after a year or so, then we got more comfortable saying goodbye. And then what did people do? They upped the number of people who quit a job. They upped the number of people who moved. People got out of relationships. People got married when they had been, on the fence. So that's a classic way that we were hesitant along goodbye. So maybe you're a list maker and maybe you are a planner and maybe you're going to move or whatever, then go to the messy middle. The point is, you do not have to do these things in order, even though I'm telling them in order, because just as transitions are nonlinear, the phases of a life transition are nonlinear too.
I love talking about ritualizing change. When my son went to college 2 weeks ago, we went down to the beach and we had a bonfire and we played some music and had dinner and just kind of talked about this big transition in his life and big transition in my life. Maybe you could just dive into ritualizing change and just what are some other examples of that you experienced and learned about? Because I think that's, for those of us who are maybe dealing with just having lost a loved one or maybe a career change, what are some ideas of how to ritualize it? I think that can be very powerful.
Well, actually, this topic is so personal and passionate for me. I'm actually writing a new book about how we ritualize. So what is a ritual? A ritual at its core is a way to connect individuals to groups. Okay. So in fact, a lot of what we're talking about here and navigating a life transition, and basically the way to think about a transition is that the life quake puts you on your heels. And the life transition puts you on your toes, right? It is the human mechanism that responds to the life quake, right? So the life quake is the losing a loved one, as what do we see? Changing a job or retiring. That's the event. And then the transition is the way of navigating the event. It gives us the agency in this time of transformation. And what a ritual is, it connects individuals to groups, right? So if you think of what's called the big four of rituals, that would be, kind of childhood rituals like baptism or things like that, like coming of age rituals like a bar mitzvah or a quinceañera or going to college, or a mating ritual, a marriage back when people actually got married as opposed to just cohabitate, and then a funeral. Like these are the big four. And in fact, what's going on now is that we're doing more of these because we live a lot longer than when these were coined. So a ritual, it might be it might be a retirement party, right? It might be a housewarming. It might be a house goodbye, right? It might be a prayer circle. It might be a sweat lodge. It might be jumping out of an airplane. I talked to a woman who had an awful year. She was a bone marrow donor to her brother. She went on 52 first dates and she was struggling with work, and she was like, what's the thing I'm most afraid of? Heights. And so she jumped out of an airplane, right? It was a way, and a year later she was married with a child. So there is this, it's a signal, if you will, to yourself, but especially to those around you, that you're going through a change. You've normalized it and you've made it a communal event.
Thank you.
And by the way, I just want to say, the night before my kids went to college, now a month ago, we also had a gathering, and I wanted, because a lot of these rituals have bonfires, and I wanted to do it, but we were inside. So I took a candle and we went around and actually, everybody said their hopes for the transition. And also we did a sort of forgiveness thing where everybody sort of forgave everybody for whatever collection of sins that they might have. And so that was on a Saturday night. And then we drove our children to college. And then the next night, one of my daughters had this gathering with a freshman counselor. And she did the same thing with a candle. And she said, I want you to write out your fears of what about going to college. And we would normally burn them, but instead, in this case, we're going to clip them. So back to back, separate worlds, separate cultures, this idea of fire and light and togetherness and fear and using the group to expunge these emotions. These are real things. Every culture for 10,000 years we've studied uses rituals in times of change.
And I bet that made you a very happy dad to see your daughters carrying that forward. That's great. Please put any questions you have about navigating change into the Q&A box. Happy to take a few of your questions now. I would love to have you, Bruce, just talk about the 3 keys of a balanced life. We always talk about life across 11 dimensions at Mission Wealth, finance being a very important one of those 11. But what are 3 keys of a balanced life from your research?
Yeah. So what's the difference between happiness and meaning? Happiness is what you feel. It's an emotion. It's kind of a current state, right? Animals can be happy, but animals can't have meaning, right? So what is meaning? Meaning is about stitching together past, present, and future. It's about the way you do that is fundamentally a story, and meaning in life allows you to make sense and process and find well-being even through times of unhappiness, right? So we've sort of over-indexed on happiness in this culture, and we've under-indexed on meaning. Now, if you go back a century, to a time that almost everybody here can remember in some way, most of the ways that we made meaning in our lives were given to us, okay? We had to live where our parents wanted us to live, do what our parents wanted us to do, believe what our parents wanted us to believe, love who our parents wanted us to love, etc. Now, today, most of that has gone. You can live where you want to live, do what you want to do, believe what you want to believe, love what you want to love who you want to love. And that's great. And a majority of people have really benefited, particularly women, right, who have much more freedom now, particularly people who are in some sort of minority, like LGBTQ people, right, or people from racial and ethnic minorities who have a lot more freedom in the world than they would have had a century ago. That's a blessing, but it also comes with a consequence. And the consequence is that we freeze, right? We get writer's block writing the story of our own life because we have too many choices. And that's often a frightening thing. So one of the things that was hardest for me to figure out that I'm sort of most proud of is that I have identified what I call the 3 building blocks of meaning, which is what you're asking me about, that I'm calling the ABCs of meaning. So what is the A? The A is agency. Okay, that's what we do or make or build, the things that we can control. Okay, that's agency. In narrative terms, that's our me story. The B is belonging. That's our love in our lives, our relationships, our family, our friends, our colleagues, our co-religionists, like the people we play on the tennis team with or march in political rallies with. In narrative terms, that's our we story. And then the C is a cause. That's a calling, a purpose, something higher than yourself. I call it your the story, right? So everybody here can do a simple exercise now in your head or afterwards with loved ones. Like if I give you 100 points, how would you allot them, right? We all have all 3 in us, right? So I'm an ABC, I'm a writer, I'm very agentic, I'm a very involved family member, super involved dad. So I'm probably, cause is less important to me, right? So I'm probably, let's just say 50-40-10 for the purpose of this. My wife, who works with entrepreneurs around the world, she's a CAB. She's very cause-oriented. And then agentic, she's a founder and a CEO. Outside of family, relationships are less important to her. So she's probably 50, sort of 40-10-50. But what happens, and this is the key thing, is that in a transition, we adjust our balance, right? So if you've just retired, maybe the majority of your life was about building a company or working or generating wealth or, taking care of your family. And then maybe now you want to spend more time with family, right? Or you want to give back. Or maybe you've been a primary caretaker of children, right? Or a primary caretaker of an aging relative. And then the children go off and, or the elderly person dies. And then you have more time and maybe you want to do something for yourself, or maybe you want to give back, or maybe you've been giving back and you burn out, whatever it might be. The point is, in a life transition, you shape shift, you rethink and you reevaluate your priorities and say, this is who I want to be and how I want to be spending my time and what brings me meaning right now. And the great gift of the nonlinear life, and as we pivot to work, this will come up even more, is that you don't have to do the same thing forever. You can change as your life is nonlinear and as change has been normalized across the whole lifespan.
Thank you, Bruce. We have a few questions that have come in here on transitions, so I'll try to group some together. Could you please share the skills to go through a transition? The first is to validate and normalize, and then what's next? And then there's some follow-up questions saying, in any specific insights for people who've suffered a health crisis and how they can then kind of rebuild new habits after having a health crisis, if that was their big transition point.
Yeah, so let me take this actually in reverse, because I think it plays to a larger point. First of all, I'm sorry for those of you who are going through a crisis. As a cancer survivor myself, I always want to lead the 3 most powerful words that you can say to somebody in a health crisis, or frankly in a life transition of any kind, is you're not alone. As we've seen, 2/3 of us are in a transition, and many of those are health. So you're not alone. And if you're caring for someone in a health transition, you're not alone either. And so just know that we're all on this journey together. I would say a big change that I've gone through, Seth, in working on this project for the length of time I've been working on it, is that I think that my I don't want to say hypothesis, but I guess I believed at the beginning that there would be a different toolkit for a health crisis and a job crisis and a pandemic and losing your house in a natural disaster or losing your legs or whatever it might be. That turns out to be not true. That generally speaking, the stages and phases and the tools are the same, regardless of whether it's your house just burned down or you lost a loved one or you quit a job or you are voluntarily getting out of a bad marriage or stopping drinking or whatever. So you've got these phases, as I mentioned, the long goodbye, the messy middle, and the new beginning. And obviously we only have time to do it briefly. There's a lot more in the actual book. Life is in the.
I got it right here.
Oh yeah, exactly. Life is in the transitions. But there's sort of what I call 7 tools. In the long goodbye, they're basically accept that it's an emotional experience, and then use rituals to mark it in some way and this is the problem with people who make the 212 item to-do list, right? Which is they're trying to skip over the fact that they have one of what turned out to be the top 3 emotions, right? Which are fear, sadness, and shame. You're going to have fear, you're going to have sadness, you're going to have shame, or some combination, or anger, or frustration, or whatever it might be. And if you just bury it and pretend that you're not going through that, then you're not being honest with yourself, and you're not really getting all the opportunities for growth and support that you need. So those are the first 2. Basically, in the messy middle, it's shedding certain habits, including habits that you feel. Just a text popped in here from my daughter reporting on her logic midterm. You're going to shed habits, including habits that you like having a meal with a loved one, or having the job, or the money, or the status, but also habits that you don't like maybe overeating, or over drinking, or being a people pleaser, or ignoring your family so you can build your company, or whatever. And then it's this incredible period of creativity where you experiment with new habits. And I'm not even talking about creativity abstractly. I'm talking about actual creativity, like dancing or learning ukulele or painting, and then there's just some amazing stories in the book. And then the new beginning, it's updating your story and then sharing it with others. So these are 7 tools that you use in kind of whatever order works for you.
And in the book, you do a great job of outlining it and giving examples. One last question on transitions before we segue to work. We were talking about how to navigate transitions. What about those of us who want to work out in advance? So what can you do proactively to introduce change into your body, your mind, to become more acclimated to it, so that then hopefully we can better cope to those transitions when they do come? Is there anything we can do in preparation?
Yeah, I love this question. And I think it's sort of I think of it as the second hardest question that I ever get. And so I'll do the second hardest and then I'll do the hardest. So the second hardest is basically what you say, which is, can you get better at it? Right. I was recently, I think when you and I had a planning session, discuss this, I was either about to or had just, I gave this convocation address to the incoming 3,200 members of the class of Middle Tennessee State University, all of whom were asked to read or required to read Life is in the Transitions this summer. And I talked a lot about college as a kind of classic life transition, right? Because you're saying goodbye to the child, your old life, right? Where your parents did everything for you, right? You're in this messy middle where you've got some protection around you, but some freedom. You're shedding habits and creating new ones, and then you unveiling your new self. And how long is college? 4 or 5 years. And so I do think that if you use the language, if you recognize that you've been through it, if you recognize that you are going through it, I think it will help the process. I know it will help the process. That the second answer to the second largest question of yes, you can get better, A, by using language, and B, by being a hands-on, empathetic co-pilot to your loved ones or friends or neighbors or colleagues who are going through them. But the hardest question is, can you make it go faster? And the answer to that question, I believe, is no. I do believe that fundamentally, there still is an arc to the process. It turns out that 60% of people move in a life transition, right? They sell their house, right? Someone I know, moved into a tree house. They start to exercise. They work from home, remotely, part-time or not. That takes a while, actually. Even since, I have to say that, and the moving thing is very on my mind. I'm in a life transition. My way of moving, I'm not selling my house, though my wife wants to renovate more of our house than I want to right now. But I have started exercising more. I've lost 10 pounds actually in the last month. So that's my way of moving. Like, okay, I'm going to work on my body, and you just can't do that overnight. So I do think that the process itself requires reflection and reimagining and taking stock and seeing how it changes or whatever. So I think you can get better at it, but I'm not convinced you can actually shorten it in a meaningful way.
Thank you. Well, I know we could dive into transitions more and more, but let's switch gears and let's talk about the future of work and the importance of purpose in work. And one of the things that really surprised me as I was going through your book is some disturbing research out there as to what the reality is today in America. So maybe you could start with that. Talk about the kind of situation we have going on in work and why purpose is so critical.
Yeah, so I think that I think that the first idea from the part of the conversation we just had to the new part is to actually carry forward, before we get to meaning, is to carry forward excuse me, the idea of nonlinearity. Okay, so that most of us grew up in an era where we believed that you had to make a choice or decision about work, follow your passion, right? Whatever, in your 20s, and then this stuck with you. This turns out to be not at all true, and not at all how younger people, millennials and Zers in particular, have thought about work. So let's pull back. Let's do my 30-second big thing. Yeah, the most influential story in the history of work is the Garden of Eden, actually, because it sort of normalized the idea. What was the punishment for Adam and Eve when they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden? Answer: work. Like, okay, now everything's not going to be taken care of you, right? So for most of human history, we had this idea that work was supposed to be miserable. Okay, so for 12,000 years, from the agricultural revolution to more or less 200 years ago, it took 90% of people 90% of their time just to survive, right? To grow the food, to build the houses, to make their own candles, to care for their young, to take care of the sick, bury the dead, whatever it might be. So the first big change that occurred was 200 years ago in the Industrial Revolution, when for the first time, a third of the workforce lost their job, moved to cities, and you had new jobs and people without jobs, and they had no way to talk to each other. Excuse the street cleaner outside the window here in Brooklyn. And with that change came a change in how we talked about work. There had never been a word for career, but suddenly we needed this idea of career. And a guy named Frank Parsons in Boston invents the idea of career counseling. And what was the idea? The idea was, once in your life, if you were a male in your 20s, they would sit you down, ask you a group of questions, give you a list of companies, set up an interview, and you'd be done. And for the rest of your life, you had to work not only in that vocation, but in that particular job. Okay. The next big change occurs 50 years later, when we move from the industrial economy to the knowledge economy, right? From the factory floor to the office floor, right? From people who shower after work to people who shower before work is the way I like to think about it. And that begins another change. So for the first time, you could change jobs, but only on a linear path. And what was the invention that we came up with at that time? The answer is the resume. No one ever needed a resume because no one ever changed jobs and no one had ever had this linear path. So we have this idea of a linear life, and that's what we have normalized. Today, we don't have that life anymore, and we are slow to recognize the change. So there's a whole bunch of reasons for this, which I will not go into. They're in The Search, right? Which is the book I just wrote about work. And It's because women are now working, 80% of women are working outside of the workplace, right? It's because job quitting has become normalized. 50 million Americans quit a job in the last year. That's a third of the workforce, okay, of 160 million people. And another 50 million people said, I don't want to go to the office 5 days a week if they're white collar workers, okay? And we see employers pushing back, but even the Google, Facebook, whatever, Amazon, all the ones saying come to the office, they're only 3 days a week. No one's expecting people to show up in the office 5 days a week. We are in a massive moment of change. And paradoxically, we actually have millennials to thank for it. Okay. So just one data point from my book, I think. So I did all these interviews about work. And I said to people, what's the number one value of work you learned from your parents? Answer, hard work. Like even the millennials, they want to work hard. Like that is built into the American fabric and to the identity of being alive at this moment of time. But when I ask people the downsides, number one answer, overwork. This is what they learned from their parents. Number two, strain on the family. Number three, unhappiness. If you want to understand work today, understand those numbers. People still want to work hard, but they are not prepared to overwork, to put a strain on the family, and to say, I'm prepared to be unhappy. The idea of work around the clock. I'm telling you to move to St. Louis, and 2 years later, I'm going to tell you to move to Kansas City, and 4 years after that, I'm going to tell you to relocate to Atlanta. And you say jump, I'm going to jump. That's not going to happen. Okay. Maybe there's a second breadwinner. Maybe you're not prepared to work too hard. Maybe the kids are on travel soccer and have a friend group. So this is a massive change that has happened. And the heart of it is we have what I call the 3 lies about work. Like you have a career. No, you don't. Half the people who change jobs change vocations. Like you can change whatever you want for whatever reason you want. Number 2, you have a path. You don't have a path. You can stay on the path if you want. Think of all the women we know of our generation, Seth, who would say, if you get off the escalator, you'll never get on. Like, what has squandered more human potential? I mean, Crystal, who's here, like Crystal's not going to grow up with this idea that if she wants to spend time with young children, if she's blessed and chooses to have young children, that it will ruin her career. That's ridiculous. Okay. And we are moving beyond these old stereotypes that we are haunted by to say, you can, so those are the lies. The third one is you have a job because we have multiple jobs. But the one truth is you get to decide the story you want to tell. And that's what's been missing in the workplace. And what I tried to do in the search is give you a toolkit for deciding what it is that brings you meaning. Because you can change, you have 20 workquakes in your life, you can change what you're doing and what brings you meaning for any reason as simple as you just want to. But we've told people you're supposed to be miserable. We haven't told people you can be happy and find meaning, and we haven't given them the tools to find that.
Mm-hmm. And let's dive into those tools. So when someone says, okay, I really want to think about what brings me meaning, both at work and outside, what are some tools that you can offer for them to kind of dig deeper into that?
So the larger frame for this, the tool that is the essential tool is what I call a meaning audit, right? Which is to do what I refer to as personal archaeology, where you dig inside yourself. So the big change that we're talking about here is that we made a series of decisions around work, largely based on the idea of what you should do. This is what I call the should train. You're going to get on the should train, right? You're going to do what your parents want you to do, what your culture expects. And accepts, but you're going to meet these external metrics of achievement. Okay. The problem is that those external metrics of achievement may not correlate or speak to or echo in your own internal metrics of achievement. So if you're out there, I mean, the way I think about this is that the story we've told about work in this country from the very beginning, like this goes back to Ben Franklin, is all about up, right? Higher floor, bigger office, greater salary, more benefits, up by your bootstraps, rags to riches. That's the story. Straight up, almost entirely external metrics, largely around money. And yet the people who are happiest and most fulfilled in what they do, they don't just climb, they also dig. Because if what drives you is not money, if you're driven by money, good for you, right? There's a lot of value in that. It's providing for your family, right? It's overcoming the pain you might have had as a child if you grew up without a lot of money. It might be, I have to pay off my college debt, so I need to raise money. Or in our case, we're sending kids to college and that's expensive. So there's no stigma attached to working hard for money. The stigma is that that's the only story that you can tell about work, because a lot of people want to give back, right? To join the military, to be school teachers, okay, to be creators, to write novels, to garden, to be outdoors, to whatever it might be. And the point of the advantage of the nonlinear life is that you can change anytime. Like you can go do something. Maybe you want to go make money. Let's look at the retirees. Maybe if they're in this community, right, and they're coming to private wealth management groups, part of the conversation you're having with them, and part of the reason that people like you are valued in the workplace, and I know enough about you to know the stuff of what you're doing, whether it's from YPO or helping families, is, okay, you might have been telling one story for most of your life and you need a new story. And part of that, by the way, is the long goodbye, where you accepted that old part of you was gone, and the messy middle of figuring out what story and then going to live it. So in the workspace, it's what I call this meaning audit. That's the larger process that we're talking about. And then my book offers a series of questions and tools, which are basically, as I call it, as I think about it now, like 21 questions to find work you love, a way of quizzing yourself and asking yourself, what do you want to be doing right now? So you make sure that you're telling your story and not the story that other people want you to tell.
And I love thinking about purpose as a purpose portfolio. So yes, we derive a lot of meaning from work, but there's also, maybe it's a ceramics class or being a parent or volunteering. So, purpose doesn't have to be this one thing. It can come from a collective of experiences. And I think with the pandemic, it's opened a lot of us up to these other hobbies and interests. So, it's how we as employers, I think, can really help embrace the whole person at work so that they can feel seen and appreciated and feel like they have some liberties to pursue all these dimensions of themselves.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I do think that has been normalized, in part the pandemics and part younger generations. That's what we sort of skipped over it, but that's what I think of as the third lie, which is that you have a job. And in fact, everybody has multiple jobs, right? So we may have a main job, but frankly, in the current economy, only half of us even have a main job. We have care jobs, like caring for relatives or children or neighbors or whomever it might be. We have a side job, which we hear about a lot. 3/4 of people have that. But 86% of us, and I have two original terms of mine, have what I call a hope job, which is something that you're doing on the side that you hope leads to something else. And it could be selling pickles at the farmer's market. It could be writing a screenplay. And a lot of times entrepreneurship comes out of this, right? I have a story in my book about a guy who was a lawyer at Goldman Sachs, first generation Korean American, right? Who lived his parents' dream, right? Became a lawyer and got a job at Goldman Sachs. But his hope job, because he grew up sharing a bathroom with three sisters, was redoing kitchens and bathrooms, and so he had a hope job, which was helping friends redesign their interior spaces. And then he eventually got to the point where that was bringing in enough money. He then made his hope job his main job, but he still wasn't bringing in the income he wanted. So he still took he quit Goldman Sachs, but he still took some legal jobs on the side to help pay the bills. And so there you get at this sort of, I call it work 360. Other people call it portfolio. That's this idea that what's non-negotiable is the meaning. So maybe your main job doesn't give you meaning. It pays the bills and gives you the health insurance or whatever it might be. But maybe the side job or the hope job gives you meaning, and you're gonna do things in your life that give you meaning, because that's the call and the opportunity of the moment that we're in now.
One question on this subject before we switch gears to families, and this is not an easy one, but I'm going to ask you to try to do it in 60 seconds or less.
Okay.
Arthur Brooks talks about first half of life, we have our fluid intelligence, essentially reason, and then we morph into crystallized intelligence, which is more wisdom, integrative wisdom. So you talked about the knowledge economy, that we shifted into, but now we're in kind of a wisdom economy. And with AI coming in, handling the knowledge piece, what would you say to our people who are, 55 and older, about how they're in a unique place with their wisdom to apply that to find meaning in their lives.
I love Arthur Brooks. I consider Arthur Brooks a friend of mine. I disagree with Arthur Brooks. In 60 seconds, and David Brooks, the Brooks brothers, they're not brothers, wrote a book called The Second Mountain too. I fundamentally disagree with this idea that this only can begin after you've climbed the first mountain or after you've lived the first half of your life. That may have been David. In fact, it really was David in a lot of ways. And that may have been Arthur. And in a lot of ways, it was Arthur in a lot of ways. But some people lose a parent when they're 12, or some people get cancer at 43, or some people decide early in their lives that they want to join the military or work in a nonprofit. So I believe that this wisdom can happen at any time. But since the question that you asked me was, what can you do if you're over 55? I think you can do it at 35. But the core exercise is get off the should train and get on the want train. And in order to do that, you have to do the personal archaeology, go back to your childhood and realize, ask yourself one question, since you gave me, and I got 15 seconds left. I read this fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen called Auntie Toothache, about a young boy who has a way with words, who's going to be a poet, but also a lot of toothaches. And his this figure called Auntie Toothache, who comes to him in a dream, says, every great poet has a great toothache. Did you have a toothache as a child? Something that nagged at you, that was a problem you wanted to resolve, right? Or a tension you wanted to escape. Everybody listening to us has been carrying your whole life something that you're trying to resolve, a question that you want to answer. If you can identify that question and then set out to have a portion of your life designed to doing whatever it is that the resolution, it could be making money, it could be helping others, it could be escaping a bad childhood, it could be some empathy you have, it could be whatever. In the search, I go through all of the different things. If you can identify what is the purpose that has been inside you your whole life, or a new one, and you can spend part of your time addressing that, that's the way to get, that is one powerhouse way to get more meaning out of your life.
I love it. Powerful. All right, let's switch gears to families. So we've got like 8 minutes to talk about families. Let's focus kind of the secrets of happy families around a lens toward money and values.
Yeah.
So maybe what's some of your learnings in that dimension?
So I have been writing about families basically since I became a father. As I mentioned, I'm a very involved family member, and there's a sort of a problem in families, which is that most of us are unhappy or frustrated or exhausted. And what do? You know, sort of we turn to our parents, though their experience is irrelevant for modern parents, or we Facebook our friends and they're just as clueless as we are. But there's actually a lot of wisdom outside of the family spirit. We're whatever now, 125 years after the birth of psychology, like they've had their chance. Like it turns out that there's a lot of wisdom, like about how to build teams and sports and how to manage money, and you know, among smart money people about you know how to fight more effectively with people who are conflict negotiators. And sort of my work in families has been about bringing this idea in. And I would say there's kind of three things I've learned about families. High functioning families, and as you said, I've written a lot about this in my book, The Secrets of Happy Families, and elsewhere, have three things in common. Number one, they adapt all the time. Now, when I came up with that, I didn't have the idea of linearity and all the data that I have now, but it's the same thing, right? I thought, I'm a parent. I'll set 5 rules and we'll follow them. Well, guess what? Life interrupts and you get cancer, and grandma needs to sell her house or has to move in with you, right? Or mom loses a job, or dad wants to change a profession and goes back to school, or whatever it might be. Like, lives are not linear, and you have to be agile, and you have to have a way of managing that agility, right? So in my book, one of the ideas about the book that's kind of worked most successfully is we have family meetings in my family. Both my immediate family with my kids and my wife, and also my extended family, like ways to like, where are you and how can we address the problems we have now? So high functioning families adapt all the time. Number 3 is high functioning families go out and play, right? So whatever you're doing, if you find time to bond, whether it's movie night or game night or travel or hiking or whatever it might be, sounds the simplest, but it's often the hardest to do, make positive memories. But it's the middle one that you asked me about, which is that high functioning families talk a lot. And it's not just talk to one another and recreate. It's about what it means to be part of your family. And in Secrets of Happy Families, I walked people through a process that Jim Collins, the great management theorist, the theorist of good to great, walked me through, which is how to make a family mission statement, which is to identify the values. And this especially applies to money. 80%, 80, of children or grandchildren or however old you are, go to college having never had a conversation about money with their parents, where it comes from, what's debt, what's interest, what's investment, 80%. Why? Because we're scared to talk about it. Here's the most important thing. If you remember one thing about this section, maybe the whole day, every conversation about money is a conversation about values, even a conversation about money that doesn't happen. Because the conversation about money that doesn't happen is sending the value that talking about money is hard. I literally just said to my wife, we need to have a conversation with our children who are 18, just beginning their whole dating life about money, maybe even about prenup, about these kinds of things that are very, very difficult to talk to, because I know several people now going through messy divorces where, a prenup, would have been helpful. We are a long way away from that, but that's when you want to talk about it. And I met a guy named Byron Trott who advises 100 of the top 100 wealthiest families. He agreed to meet me to talk about, and the only interview he's ever given was with me. In fact, there was an article about him in the Washington Post not long ago. The quotes from Happy Families were the only quotes in, because he doesn't talk to the press. He's Warren Buffett's private banker. And I told him this story. I was like, oh yeah, at the time my kids were very young. And I was like, oh yeah, we give them an allowance, and we make them divide the money into, spend and save and give away and invest. And this is a genius plan I've come up with for their $6 when they were 6. And he's like, that's a bad idea. And I'm like, no, Brian, look, the whole purpose of this is to give him experience with different things and money. And he's like, no, you want to have them do it themselves. And I was like, well, what if they make a mistake? Or what if they drive into a ditch? And he told me the single smartest thing that anyone's ever told me about families and money, which is it's much better to drive into a ditch with a $6 allowance than a $60,000 a year salary or a $6 million inheritance. So as your children are young, as your family is coming together, you want to normalize the idea that you can talk about money so that you're not doing it after grandma dies and suddenly there's tension and there's disagreement. You need to develop a culture where you can talk about money in your family, and you want to do it in a way, not at Thanksgiving, not when you're washing the dishes or on the beach, a set aside time where everybody is seated upright. It's better to have somebody from the outside there, so everybody will be on your best behavior. But money's about values, and the only way to explore values is to talk about them.
Yes. And taking that to kind of another level, we've had a lot of clients kind of bring up this topic of, well, should I have full transparency? Should I show my kids the balance sheet, exactly what we're worth, what our plans are, what our thoughts are around, when we pass? Do you have any thoughts on that full transparency approach, taking this conversation of money and values to full everything?
Yeah, so I think that the short answer to that is you would not do that with a 5-year-old. Now, so what I assume when you say that is you're talking about in the money in the family wealth space, and I sort of have kind of fallen into the space, and I do a lot of speaking about this, right? You talk about Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3, Gen 4. Gen 1 is often where the money is made, and and by the way, often in Gen 1 there is, by the way, what turned out to be a myth, which is that giving children money or access to money will make them lazy. There's literally no data to support that, and yet it is a conviction that has somehow taken and fold, and is particularly ripe among Gen 1 people who made the money themselves, who look at themselves and sort of extrapolate from their own experience. We all know families, multi-generation families, where there is wealth, where some children work hard and some children don't. There's no correlation between coming from money and having an intrinsic work ethic. They're completely different. Now, there are ways of doing this, and there are, people like yourselves and other people who have a lot of expertise. So the short answer is you want to do it in an age-appropriate way. Okay, I have a good business doing this myself, and I can tell you that I was recently in the home of one of the top 10 wealthiest families in the country, giving a talk and helping them. And they, when the kids turned 18, started giving everybody a check, and they have regretted doing that. But there is know-how out there, people, and there, seek out wisdom out there. But there are ways you want to balance. I think the general way is if I could come up with a couple of rules of thumb. Rule of thumb number one: never lie. You don't want to say something that you have to unsay later. Like, this goes with, do you believe in God? If your kid at 5 years old, your grandkid asks you, do you believe in God? Don't say you do if you don't. You don't want to lie, because your credibility means everything. You can say, what do you believe? Or sometimes this or something. So whatever you're doing, tell the truth, no matter how, if the kid's 2. Always tell the truth, but you can be somewhat selective about telling the truth, depending on what's age appropriate and depending on what your family wants. Number 2, you can set up a relationship between doing things for your family and getting some money over time. Okay. So number 1, always tell the truth. Number 2, never talk about it. Right. So don't worry. Don't worry, Crystal. Don't worry, little Sethi. I got it taken care of. After I die, you'll get an envelope, and it'll tell you what I've put for you. That's ridiculous. By the way, I come from a family that talks about this a lot, and my wife is in a family because my father-in-law is a trust and estates lawyer. So the position all along has been, oh, he's got it. He's an expert. He advises families on this. I'm like, I'm sorry, BS. Okay, the children are now in their 50s. They need to understand what's going on, and they need to have a voice at the table. So the shocking thing, and then the last thing I'll say is ask the next gen what they want to know, what they want to be included, what they don't, what matters to them. A kind of core rule in families is stop holding and hoarding all the power yourself. Whether you're a parent of 5-year-olds, or in this case, whether you're a family with some means, there are going to be $60 trillion passed on intergenerationally in the next 20 years. Okay, the idea that all the wisdom belongs to the people 60 plus is ridiculous, because young people also have needs and desires and wisdoms and expectations, and you're assuming what they want. Ask them.
Yes. It's about empowerment, indeed. And you've empowered us today, Bruce. So thank you so much for sharing these insights, how we can navigate transitions, how we can invite more meaning into our lives, and more connection with our loved ones.